And I'd like you to turn to the book of Joshua and to follow along. And the reason that I want you to do this is not only because we do this typically on a regular basis, but in this series that I've been preaching of late, I've been doing a lot of jumping around to different parts of the Bible, and I am going to be going to a few passages today. But unlike the other sermons in the current series, I'm really focusing heavily just on one passage, and it is this 22nd chapter of the book of Joshua, which is the 6th book of the Bible. And to acquaint you with this in the grand scheme of history, I hope that you have one of these, this Bible timeline that you would have received at one time or another. And if you were to open up your Bible timeline to the front side of it here, the green section all the way on the right side is the conquest and judges area, and that's where the book of Joshua takes place. So that's what we're going to be looking at right now. And I want you to open up to have that there. And once you open it up, then kind of get comfortable with setting it on your lap or setting it beside you or something like that, because we're going to read that and go piece by piece through it together once we get into the message a little bit. I want to set the tone, set the stage for why Joshua 22 is important, and then in a little bit we're going to work our way through it together, okay? So I've been preaching this series called Election Year for a couple of months now, and we're getting close to the end. Actually, next week will be the last week of it. And this series has been looking at how do we find wisdom from God in the Bible for what is right, what is wrong, and how to serve Him and love Him and obey Him, and to love and serve others as citizens in this American democracy in which we live, which American Christians have been looking to the Bible for answers for generations, and we're continuing to do that now. We've looked at a variety of different things to get to this point, looked at some big issues of what is government, what is the law, what is America, is it a Christian nation, and then also looking at some hot topics. And we're looking at something here today that I was thinking about, a particular hot topic that I thought I might talk about, and that issue was gun control. I was thinking that I was going to say something about gun control, which has become a very, very big topic. It's been a big topic for many years, and definitely when there was the mass shooting at Columbine High School about 20 years ago, it was a huge deal then, and it has just continued to become a bigger and bigger issue over time. But I decided not to do a sermon on that because I just didn't know what I was going to say. So I said, well, then I guess I'm not going to preach on it. But what I did think, as I was thinking about gun control, that I was going to say is that to me the gun control issue is about something bigger and more important than just guns. It's about something bigger and more important than just guns. I think it's even bigger and more important than how to secure physical safety for us as people and as households and as a country. I think that the gun control issue is as good an example as you can come up with of how intensely divided we are as a country. And the division of our country is an issue all by itself. Just that all by itself, right? We see this in what we call partisanship in politics, where we see these intensely divided political parties in Congress or in the Pennsylvania legislature that you actually think you can find people in the Middle East who are more willing to talk to each other than the people in Congress. You know what I'm saying? And so we see this, but this intense and often mean-spirited division that we see in our political life doesn't just come from itself. It's the outflow of something else. And the gun control issue illustrates this very, very well. And what we're going to look at today is how it is that we as Christians can handle this issue of partisanship, and how we can live and function as Christ followers in this intense and bitterly divided political scene. Now, I've lived in some very different places when it comes to guns, and some of you have heard my stories. Now, I can tell you that central Pennsylvania is the gun-totingest place that I've ever lived. Okay? I've never lived in any place where more people are packing than central Pennsylvania. And I think my favorite story about this is with somebody who used to be a part of our church. She was our regular musician in our church, Kathy Ozio. Some of you know Kathy. Okay, now Kathy, as you know, probably weighs about 100 pounds sopping wet. Okay? And Kathy, one day, it was late fall, and she came into church, and she was really, really excited. And I found out that the reason she was so excited is that she just learned that her husband was going to give her an AK-47 as a Christmas present. And she was very excited about this, and she went on to explain that her husband already had his own AK-47, and now she was going to get her own, so they would have his and hers AK-47s. This was a novel concept to me. I didn't know that a Christmas present could look like that. And you know, in our particular location where we live, right? I mean, hunting is huge. You know, it's of course people have been doing it forever. I mean, people have been doing it for food forever. But as a sport that people sell to and make money off of and just do for recreation, I think it's just getting bigger all the time. You know, I mean, hunting is a big deal. And of course, as I said last week, we've got so many people who've served in the military in our area who carried weapons to defend us, to defend our freedom, to defend our country. And so, you know, there's a great deal, a very pretty high comfort level with guns here in this area. Now, I've also lived in a neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts. And in the 1980s and 1990s, in Boston, as in many cities in the United States, gang violence was on the rise and really exploded. And there became this epidemic of homicides in the city of Boston with youths, okay, so teenagers, you know, up to say maybe the age of 20, killing others with guns. So the youth gun violence thing in Boston was just going through the roof. In 1990, there were 73 youth gun homicides in the city of Boston. Not to mention homicides with guns not committed by youth, committed by adults. And it became so bad, there was a particular incident that really sort of was a spark in something that was changing. There was a funeral that was taking place in a Baptist church, Morning Star Baptist Church, in the city of Boston, a neighborhood, I believe, called Mattapan, I think is where it was. And there was a funeral for a teenager who had been shot dead. At the funeral itself, someone who had a score to settle against somebody who was attending the funeral came into the church during the funeral and opened fire on their enemies. And this started to change things, that there were a variety of different institutions, some of them public, some of them governmental, many of them private, including the pastors, the Black Ministerial Alliance there in Boston, that formed a group called the 10-Point Coalition. And our pastor, Bruce Wall, the pastor of our church when we lived in Boston, had been a founding member of that group. And these different groups worked together to get guns off the streets. And they were actually saying, bring in your guns. There's gun amnesty. You know, you just bring in your guns, you bring them in now, get rid of those guns, and get them off. And by the time we got there in 1999, there had been something that took place over the course of the 1990s called the Boston Miracle. There was one youth gun homicide in 1990. It was incredible. Now, after that, it started to go up again. And in 2003, for a few months, most of the time that we lived in Massachusetts, we lived in the suburbs. But for 3 months in 2003, we lived in Boston, and actually the empty parsonage of the church that we went to. And one morning, I woke up, Kelly went to work, and I was staying home with Jack, and I woke up, and there was a phone call. And a phone call was from a board member of the church. And he said, how are you doing? I said, I'm okay. He said, I'm just calling to check in to see if you're okay this morning. I said, yeah, what's going on? He said, you didn't know? I said, no what? And he said, there was a murder just down the street from you last night. And sure enough, I wasn't aware of it. I slept through it, but literally 2 houses away from where Kelly and I lived, in the evening, there was a young person who was walking from a convenience store, and one of his enemies rode up on a bike and shot him dead. And I just opened my front door and walked down 2 houses. Everything looked normal, sun shining, birds chirping, and there, all as if it just appeared out of nowhere, was a makeshift memorial with a cross and stuffed animals and shoes and notes that were memorializing this kid who was killed just a few hundred feet away from where I was sleeping. So I've lived in really, really different places when it comes to guns and what they do and how people think about those. And the reason I tell these stories is because you might remember a few weeks ago, I said something about facts in one of my messages. I said, a funny thing about humans is that facts don't influence us very much because our attitudes determine our facts. Our attitudes determine what facts we pay attention to. Our attitudes determine how we interpret the facts that we do pay attention to. And that seems to be what's driving us, because it seems to me that most people aren't terribly interested in facts about guns and gun use unless they back up their own opinion. And why is that? Well, it's because a gun is more than a gun. It's more than a physical object. It's more than a machine or a tool or a weapon. A gun is an object that carries meaning. Like a wedding ring is an object that carries meaning. Like a cross is an object that carries meaning. Like the American flag is an object that carries meaning. Like the Nazi flag is an object that carries meaning, that creates a very different reaction in us, right? And so a gun says something to people. It communicates meaning. People don't react to what a gun is, they react to what a gun means. And the important thing is that to different people in different places, a gun means different things. To some people, a gun means spending time with their dad in the woods when they were little. To other people, a gun means that their grandchild was dead before he reached 20 years old. To some people, a gun means the defense of our freedom against tyranny. To other people, a gun means crime lords that intimidate and murder innocent people. What feeds this stark difference isn't just different life experiences from growing up and living in different places like I described, although that's a huge part of it, but it also comes from stark differences between regional cultures in America that go all the way back to colonial times. The English who settled New England were very different from the English and the Scottish and the Irish who settled Appalachia, and so on and so forth. And to this day, different parts of the country are still really different, but we're all jammed together, stuck together, living as one nation, trying somehow to get along. And it seems to me that over the last generation, we haven't just seen partisanship get worse, we've seen regionalism get worse. Is it just me, or does it feel more and more like we're living in totally different countries under the same flag? I mean, do you realize that in 1984, which is in pretty easy memory for most of us here today, Republican Ronald Reagan won 49 states? Can you conceive of such a thing happening today? That's crazy, right? In 1988, Republican George H.W. Bush won California and Maryland. Yes, this happened. As late as 1996, 20 years ago, Democrat Bill Clinton won Louisiana, Tennessee, and Kentucky, in addition to his home state of Arkansas. But since 2000, the electoral map has looked almost the same every single year. The red states that the Republicans win and the blue states that the Democrats win. And the divide is so close that each side thinks that if it can just squeeze out a few more votes, if it can just bombard the purple states like Ohio and Florida with a few more television commercials, then maybe that side can get its way over the whole country. And each part of the country thinks that it has to do that to survive. We can't just live and let live. We can't just say, well, you guys do it the way you want over there, and we'll do it the way we want over here. Because we have free travel and free trade between states. So what happens in one place affects every place. And the other big issue is that there's a single constitution for us all. And each side is trying to make its interpretation of that constitution dominate the others. And it's not just like this with guns. It's like this with every issue under the sun. We fight winner take all about everything. So here's what really worries me. As you probably know, I've done a good bit of scholarly study on the Civil War. And I believe that the divisive regionalism of our nation today has not been seen since the run-up to the Civil War. I am very concerned about the parallels. You have two sections of the country that live differently, that believe differently, that don't understand each other. You have a situation where people are starting to feel like their very physical safety is at stake because of the policies of the other side. You have a winner-take-all political climate where each is afraid that if the other wins, they will end our life as we know it, so we need to strike first and force our will on them. And you have each side increasingly demeaning the other side, talking about the other as immoral, barbaric, stupid, or disgusting. And you have the loudest, most obnoxious voices on each side getting the most attention and the highest ratings and fueling the competition. I do not believe that it is out of the question that we might see a second American Civil War. Now, you might think I'm crazy. You might think I'm nuts. You might think, how in the world could that be possible, right? I mean, didn't we settle forever and ever that secession is illegal when 1865 ended, right? I mean, don't we have a military that's so extremely strong and powerful now that nobody could possibly revolt against it without getting smushed like a bug? Well, yeah, but notice that our military officers swear to defend the Constitution. What if there's some future commander-in-chief in the White House who gives an order to the military to put down a domestic uprising? And what if half the military obeys and the other half says no? Now, you might think that that's kind of crazy or kind of nuts, but keep in mind that, like, military infighting and coups happen all over the world all the time. And it's happened for thousands and thousands of years. So just because it's never happened here doesn't mean it can't ever happen here. We don't know that. And to put this in perspective, if you were to take the percentage of people who died in the first Civil War and you applied that today, that would be 7 million Americans. 7 million Americans if we fought the Civil War over again. So the issue of partisanship is about more than people being mean to each other in Congress and calling each other names. It's about more than the parties not working together to get things done, whatever that means, because of course we want them to do diametrically opposite things, depending on where it is you live. The issue that I'm raising today, which you'll never hear from political candidates because they're fueling it, is how are we going to prevent civil war while we can still stop it? Again, you might think I'm paranoid, but I honestly believe this is an issue. In our toxic national atmosphere, how are we Christians going to prevent the destruction of millions of lives? Now, to answer this question, we're going to look at a passage in the Bible that comes from a time when the nation of Israel almost went to civil war, and then they stopped. And we're going to see in this a three-part strategy for making peace. A three-part strategy for making peace in a divided nation and preventing civil war. Remember what I've said all along in this series, right? When it comes to politics, the Bible doesn't give us answers so much as it teaches us attitudes. And what we're going to see today is going to change our attitudes. Change your attitude, change my attitude toward Americans that we regard as the enemy. To change us so that we can change our world. So, Joshua chapter 22, if you have your timeline, if you've looked at your timeline, you can see as you go along there from left to right, that God called a man named Abraham, selected a man named Abraham, and told Abraham, Abraham, you're going to do what it is that I say, and I'm going to make you a great nation, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed, because through you and the people who descend from you, all of the nations will get to know me. And Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had a son named Jacob. God renamed Jacob Israel. Israel, then, all of his family moved down to Egypt. They lived there for 400 years. They multiplied. They became a whole great nation. They were oppressed and enslaved by the Egyptians. But then God took one of these Israelites named Moses and sent him as a leader, and with great acts of destruction called plagues upon Egypt, forced Israel to be emancipated, forced them to be liberated and let go. So Israel went out of Egypt and went through the desert and came to the land that God had promised to Abraham, the promised land, the land of Canaan, which today is Israel and Palestine and maybe bits of Lebanon and Syria mixed in. And so over the course of time, this group of people comes. They actually went up to the promised land first, and then they got scared because of the people in the land that they were going to have to fight. And so they said, well, we can't trust God anymore. And God said, you want to bet? And so God ended up saying, okay, you guys are going to wander around for 40 years until the whole generation that left Egypt died off, and your kids are going to go in there. So that happens for 40 years. And then we get to the point that the kids are grown up, Moses has died, and Joshua is the next guy who is then the leader of Israel, who's going to lead them in to take the land, to conquer the land. And so they do that, and that's what the book of Joshua is about. They go in, they conquer the land. They don't completely conquer it, but they get most of it, and they divide it up, and they settle down, and Joshua 22 happens at the end, after this stuff has happened. After they've conquered most of the Canaanites, defeated most of the Canaanites, they've divided up the land so that each tribe gets its own section, each clan gets its own section within the tribe, each family gets its own section within the clan of the farmland that they're going to be farming, their plot of ground, right? They get it all kind of dispersed, and then whatever Canaanites are left, each tribe has to deal with that locally by itself. Okay? And they're settling down, and then we have this thing that happens in Joshua chapter 22. And the first verse says this: Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Let's stop right there. We'll talk about who these guys. Why are these tribes singled out? The tribe of Gad, the tribe of Reuben, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Well, to understand that, I want you to show you this map here. Okay, this is a map of the Promised Land. All right, and you see on the right side, you see this group. Manasseh is in orange, and Gad is in purple, and Reuben is in green. And on the west border of where they are is the Jordan River. Okay, that's the Sea of Galilee in the north. It's the Dead Sea in the south. It's the Jordan River in the middle. Now, the way that Israel had approached Canaan when they had come to conquer it is they actually approached it from the east. They came up from the south, curled around the east. They went through Moab. You see Moab there. And they went through Moab, and then they kept going further north, and they ran into some guys who resisted them, said, "We don't want you coming here." And so they fought them, and they conquered them, and they eliminated them on that east side of the Jordan River. And after they did that, these tribes, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh said, we like it over here on this side of the river. We think it's pretty good. Moses, can we just live here? And Moses said, what's the deal? I mean, all the other tribes helped you by conquering these people, and now you're just going to settle down and leave the rest of your brother tribes to have to fend for themselves over on the west side? And they said, no, here's what we'll do. We'll settle our wives and our kids and our elderly and our livestock. We'll settle them all over here, and then we, the men of war, will go with our fellow Israelites across to the west side of the Jordan River, and we'll fight over there until all the rest of the tribes get their own property. And God said, that sounds good. And Moses said, all right, that's a deal. You got it. So that's what they do. And through the course here of the book of Joshua, it's been 5 years that have gone by. 5 years of these Reubenites, Gadites, and half the Manassites fighting along with Israel to conquer the land. And all that bluish area on the left, that bluish-green area, that was the rest of the territory of Israel. And so they said after 5 years had taken place and they had conquered all these and started to settle, then we get Joshua summoning these people from the east who had settled in the east, but their men of war had come over to fight in the west, says to them, verse 2, "You have done all that Moses the servant of the Lord commanded, and you have obeyed me in everything I commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your brothers, but have carried out the mission the Lord your God gave you. Now that the Lord your God has given your brothers rest as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses the servant of the Lord gave you on the other side of the Jordan. But be very careful to keep the commandment and the law that Moses the servant of the Lord gave you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to obey his commands, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and all your soul." Then Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their homes. To the half-tribe of Manasseh, Moses had given land in Bashan, but to the other half of the tribe, Joshua gave land on the west side of the Jordan with their brothers. When Joshua sent them home, he blessed them, saying, "Return to your homes with your great wealth, with large herds of livestock, with silver, gold, bronze, and iron, and a great quantity of clothing, and divide with your brothers the plunder from your enemies." So the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh left the Israelites at Shiloh in Canaan. There's Shiloh on the map, to return to Gilead, their own land, which they had acquired in accordance with the command of the Lord through Moses. When they came to Geliloth, near the Jordan, in the land of Canaan, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh built an imposing altar there by the Jordan. And when the Israelites heard that they had built the altar on the border of Canaan at Geliloth near the Jordan on the Israelite side, the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. Whoa. What is the deal? What is that about, right? I mean, these guys have been fighting side by side for 5 years. Some of them go home. On their way, they build an altar, and the western tribes are ready to go to war against the eastern tribes. Why is that such a big deal? Why would they get so upset about that? Well, see, God was very clear and very emphatic about not worshiping the gods, the Canaanites, the gods of the Canaanite nations they were conquering. It was literally a matter of life and death. I mean, God's instruction to Abraham, their ancestor, was, you're going to follow me, and through you, everybody's going to know me. Your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, everybody who descends from you, they're going to follow me, and that's how all the nations will get to know me. We talked about this last week, about how God planted these people in this particular part of the world where Europe and Asia and Africa come together, where all of the intersection of commerce and transportation and communication was right there, so that if God was going to explain himself to a whole world that had left him, a whole world who had been disobeying him and been going their own way and worshiping their own gods and sinning against him and going on their way to judgment by him after they died, if God wanted to communicate to all them, come back to me. I'm the one who can give you real life. I'm the one who can give you hope. I'm the one who can give you joy. I'm the one through whom you can live forever. Then that was the place to put it. But God couldn't communicate that to other people if his people were just like all the other people. If his people were worshiping the true God and all these other gods, how was God going to get his message across? So he's very, very careful of them, saying, look, you have to destroy all of the altars. You have to purge away all of the worship of foreign gods when you go into this place where you're going. And God knew that if they didn't do that, that they would easily go astray. They would easily start to wander away. And in fact, already while they were on their way to the Promised Land, while they were in Moab, they stopped at a place called Peor. And at Peor, some of them started to hang out with the Moabites. And they started to worship Baal, B-A-A-L, as we normally pronounce it, Baal in English. Baal, the god of the Canaanites that the Moabites worshiped too. And they were worshiping that god. And God was so upset by this, and he was so, firm in expressing to them, you cannot do this, that he sent a plague among the Israelites there at Peor, and thousands of them died until they stopped worshiping these other gods, and they put it away. So one law that God gave Israel as insurance to prevent them from worshiping other gods was to demolish all of the sacred places of the Canaanites. He said, whenever you see an altar in Canaan, wreck it. Whenever you see some sacred grove or temple or something, destroy it, level it. Don't even pretend to do anything there. Don't even worship me there. Just get rid of it. And instead, I want you to offer all of your sacrifices at one central place that you're going to travel to for a few times a year. That's where my tabernacle is going to be. That's where my presence is going to be. That's where the priests are going to be. That's where I want you to come. You can read about this in Deuteronomy chapter 12. Deuteronomy is the book before Joshua. It just so happened that that place where the tabernacle landed, the central place of worship, was Shiloh. This very place that the eastern tribes said, see you later, we're going home. And so when they went home and they built an altar on the way, the western tribes thought, we're screwing up already. Already these people, already some of us are starting to build other altars to worship other gods, and God is going to send judgment on all of us for what those tribes have done. We have got to call them to account. We have got to do something about this. So they gather at Shiloh to muster and assemble for war. And so, already we can see that they're starting to see the we as the sons of Israel, and they, those eastern tribes, are not really Israel, right? Because didn't you see it? It says that they built the altar, verse 11, on the border of Canaan near the Jordan on the Israelite side, right? Which implies that the eastern tribes aren't really Israelites. That's not really the Israelite side. And it goes on and says there that the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh. As if the western tribes are the real Israel. And those eastern tribes, well, they're not really Israel anymore because they're wandering away from the Lord. Now, before they go and attack, however, they make a very good decision. They attempt to make peace. And in this, we can see a three-part strategy for making peace before civil war. Making peace in a time of intense regional division. First part of the strategy, let's talk about what we're afraid of, and let's listen to each other. Let's talk about what we're afraid of, and let's listen to each other. Let's look at verse 13. So the Israelites sent Phinehas, son of Eleazar the priest, to the land of Gilead, to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. With him they sent 10 of the chief men, one for each of the tribes of Israel, each the head of a family division among the Israelite clans. When they went to Gilead, to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, they said to them, "The whole assembly of the Lord says, how could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against him now? Was not the sin of Peor enough for us? Up to this very day we have not cleansed ourselves from that sin, even though a plague fell on the community of the Lord. And are you now turning away from the Lord?" So do you see what they're doing? The first step is they go to them and say, like, what happened? How could you do such a thing? And what they did is they talked about their fears. They talked about what they were afraid of. They weren't just passing judgment, although they were, but they weren't just passing judgment and saying, you did this terrible thing. They're saying, look, my child died, my uncle died, my cousin died, my husband died at Peor because of the idolatry that we committed against the Lord. And now you're committing idolatry again? What else am I going to lose because of what you do? What other destruction? Maybe I'm going to lose my own life this time because of your sin. Maybe God is going to send destruction on us. Maybe he's going to send famine upon us, and we're all going to starve. Maybe he's going to send a plague. Maybe he's going to send our enemies to come and wipe us out. Don't you see that what you're doing is threatening my life? See, it's easy when we're talking to people who are different to argue at the level of thought or to argue at the level of right and wrong, but it's another whole thing to approach people and say, listen to me. Let me be vulnerable with you for a minute. If you do what you think is right, I think that my life is going to get hurt really, really bad. This is what I'm afraid of. This is what I'm afraid of for me. This is what I'm afraid of for my family. This is what I'm afraid of for my nation. This is what I'm afraid of. So let's talk about it. Let me listen to you. Let me ask you, what were you thinking when you did this? Explain this to me. See, we got to start by talking about what we're afraid of. When we think about our partisan divide today, when we think about what the other side, however you define the other side, when we think about what the other side is going to do, what are we afraid of if they succeed? What is our fear? Let's tap into that and be honest about it and be willing to talk about it. Be vulnerable and be willing to put it out there. So then the second part of the strategy is let's be willing to give up our rights and to relieve the other's fears. Let's be willing to give up our rights and relieve the other's fears. Look at verse 19, or the second half of 18. If you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow he will be angry with the whole community of Israel. We're afraid of this. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land, where the Lord's tabernacle stands, and share the land with us. But do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourselves other than the altar of the Lord your God. Do you see what they're doing here? They're actually saying, okay, yeah, we've already divided up the land. We already know, Judah has this part, and Asher has this part, and Dan has this part, and Ephraim has this part. We've all divided the whole thing up. But you know what? We'll divide it again. We'll redo. Just, if the reason you're doing this, or if being away, if being on the other side of the river tempts you guys to sin, just come over here. We'll share, We'll each give up 25% of our property and give it to you. It is yours. You can have it. Just don't rebel against the Lord. What an amazing thing. See, they were willing to give up their rights. They could have just said, hey, look, this land is my land. It is my land. I fought for it. I have it. It was given to me by lot, by the Lord. It is mine. It belongs to me. Thank you very much. So you're just going to have to change what you're doing. But no, they said, I'm actually willing to give of my own. I'm actually willing to give up my rights to my stuff. Give up my rights to my possessions. Give up my rights to what I like to do. Give up my rights to my customs. If we can just stay together. And if that will relieve your fears. If it will be easier for you to survive, Eastern tribes, for us to give up some of what belongs to us, we will do it. We would rather do that than see you disobey the Lord and threaten us all as a nation. If we're going to overcome partisanship in our country, we have to be willing to give up our rights to relieve the fears of the other. The other side, whatever they are, whoever they are, whatever it is that they want, what are they afraid of? What are they afraid of? And are we willing to give up our rights to help them and to soothe their fears, to give them more peace of mind? So then the third part of the strategy for making peace is let's affirm our common heritage and our common concerns. Verse 20, when Achan, son of Zerah, acted unfaithfully regarding the devoted things, did not wrath come upon the whole community of Israel? He was not the only one who died for his sin. This is a situation that's described in chapter 7 of Joshua where there was one man who did something that God did not want him to do. That God told the whole people, when you go into Jericho, don't take anything from it. I'll let you take things from other towns, but don't take anything from Jericho. Just set the whole thing on fire, possessions and all. And one guy stole some stuff out of there. And then the entire nation, when they fought their next battle, were defeated. And there were people there who could say, do you remember when your brother, when your cousin, when your uncle, when your nephew, when your friend died in the battle after Achan's sin? We don't want that to happen again. See, they affirm their common heritage. We've gone through a common experience here. We have common concerns. None of us want to experience that defeat again. So can we come together on this? And if we're going to overcome civil war in this country, we have to find what is our common heritage, what are our common concerns. There's got to be something. We know there is. And to use that as the point of appeal for how we can continue to walk together. So what happens as a result of this? What happens? Then Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh replied to the heads of the clans of Israel, the mighty one, God the Lord. The mighty one, God the Lord. He knows, and let Israel know. If this has been in rebellion or disobedience to the Lord, do not spare us to this day. If we have built our own altar to turn away from the Lord and to offer burnt offerings and grain offerings or to sacrifice fellowship offerings on it, may the Lord himself call us to account. No, we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, what do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you Reubenites and Gadites. You have no share in the Lord, so your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord. That is why we said, let us get ready and build an altar, but not for burnt offering or sacrifices. On the contrary, it is to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and fellowship offerings. Then in the future, your descendants will not be able to say to ours, you have no share in the Lord. And we said, if they ever say this to us or to our descendants, we will answer, look at the replica of the Lord's altar, which our fathers built, not for burnt offerings and sacrifices, but as a witness between us and you. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord and turn away from him today by building an altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, and sacrifices, other than the altar of the Lord our God that stands before his tabernacle. Isn't this amazing? The whole thing was a huge misunderstanding the whole time. And they almost slaughtered each other because of it. And it was actually because these two groups of people wanted the same thing. The eastern tribes were afraid that the western tribes wouldn't count them as part of the people of God. But the step that they took to address the problem, building the altar, actually caused the very problem they were trying to solve. The western tribes thought that it meant the eastern tribes were wandering away from the Lord. Once the two regions talked it out the way they did, they found that they actually had deep common ground after all. And what's really cool about this is that when the two sides made peace, they took that as proof that God was real. and that God was really among them. Look at verse 30. When Phinehas the priest and the leaders of the community, the heads of the clans of the Israelites, heard what Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh had to say, they were pleased. And Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the priest, said to Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, today we know that the Lord is with us, because you have not acted unfaithfully toward the Lord in this matter. Now you have rescued the Israelites from the Lord's hand. Then Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the priest, and the leaders returned to Canaan from their meeting with the Reubenites and Gadites in Gilead and reported to the Israelites. They were glad to hear the report and praised God, and they talked no more about going to war against them to devastate the country where the Reubenites and the Gadites lived. And the Reubenites and the Gadites gave the altar this name, a witness between us that the Lord is God. Isn't that cool? That just makes me feel warm all over. Isn't that great? I mean, it's just like a big group hug at the end of the story. It's like the coolest thing, you know? Like they find the common ground and they get together. So let's review the strategy again, right? And this is a strategy, my friends, that it doesn't just apply to a divided country, but it applies to a divided company. It applies to a divided church. It applies to a divided family. And it goes like this. Let's talk about what we're afraid of, and let's listen to each other. Let's be willing to give up our rights and to relieve the other's fears. And let's affirm our common heritage and common concerns. How do we put this into practice? Well, I'll tell you, the details are as many as the different details of issues or different details of people's lives. And we need the wisdom from God. We need the wisdom from the Holy Spirit, who is the Spirit of peace, to teach us how to put these into practice. But my friends, there's enough Christians in this country that there should be no need for us to go to war. You know, back 150 plus years ago, there were even more Christians than there were today. And there were enough Christians then to prevent us from going to war. And it didn't work. What can we do this time? What can you do? What can I do? My friends, none of us are good enough for this. None of us are enough for this. None of us can do what Jesus said perfectly. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. My friends, who is strong enough to do that? That's a hard thing to do. And what Jesus was talking about when he said if somebody slaps you on the right cheek, if you're right-handed and you're going to hit me on the right cheek, you're not going to punch like this. You're going to slap like that. Backhand. Boom. That's how a right-hander hits somebody on the right cheek. In Jesus' day, that's what superiors did to inferiors. That's what a Roman would do to a Jew. That's what an upper-class Jew would do to a lower-class Jew. That's what a man would do to a woman. Backhand slap. Jesus says if somebody hits you that way, turn the other cheek. It's a way of saying, okay, hit me again, but hit me as an equal. My friends, there may come a time that the other side will not listen, whoever the other side is. There may come a time that they achieve dominance, that they end your life, my life, our lives as we know it. There may come a time that their belief that they're superior to you, that they're superior to us, that they actually act on that by giving us backhand after backhand after backhand. But there's always a way to resist without playing that game of slapping back. There's a way. There's a way. Jesus said, if you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. My friends, I'm not a perfect man. And no offense, but I'll just be honest with you, I don't think you're perfect either. Forgive me for this, but I'm just being straight with you here. But there is one who is perfect. The Lord our God is perfect. And his Son, who is fully God and fully human, Jesus Christ, is the perfect one. And you and I, if we confess our sins, if we admit that we are imperfect and we need the perfect righteousness of a righteous God, or else we are under judgment, we can receive that perfection. Perfection in his sight today, perfection in his sight on the day of judgment, and a growing perfection in our lives now that can actually do this. And that just might change our world. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. During this last song, let us prepare ourselves